Welcome, welcome to Through the CSI Lens, Behind the Yellow Tape podcast, Season 2, Episode 3. I'm Christina Brakeman, and I am your host. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully this finds you all doing well, staying healthy. I know I've been under the weather for the last weekish, and hearing from a lot of you that, you're on that struggle bus as well. I guess it's that time of year. But hopefully this finds you doing well and enjoying your weekend. Sorry, this is a little bit late. Schedule's super busy and just trying to manage my time as efficiently as possible. And so, yeah, we're here. And today, let's talk a little bit about our last episode. So last episode, we talked about PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and how that can show up as a crime scene investigator or a forensic scientist. Obviously, I'm more in tune with the crime scene investigation part of it because that was my job for so long. And, I hope the takeaway for you from that episode is that it is real. Don't let people fool you or try to convince you otherwise, that your mental health is just as important as a first responder or anyone else for that matter, and that you need to take your mental health, your physical health, whatever type of health it is, into your own hands, that you can't rely on anybody else, although they may have resources out there for you. At the end of the day, it's your responsibility to take care of yourself, for your own self, for your family, your friends, and for longevity, especially in that profession. And I encourage you to use the resources that have been given to you and to do your own research when you're looking for a therapist, because I honestly think if you're going to stay in that position, in that profession, you are going to need ongoing therapy to help work through the type of things that you see and hear, smell, and all the things. I think for longevity, you're going to need that. And also when you retire, because I have that perspective as well, how that starts to show up in retirement. And, you have worked and dedicated and sacrificed so much and given service for so long. You deserve to enjoy retirement. So again, just, make sure you're checking in with yourself, have a solid system in place, and have good people around you that are going to help you in those moments that you need a little bit extra. So don't hesitate to do that for yourself. So hopefully that helps some of you and will help you moving forward. And like I said, longevity is always the goal. So today I thought we would talk a little bit about death scenes in general. And every agency, excuse me, is going to be a little bit different as far as how they handle, how they respond, how they process death scenes, death investigations. So of course, I'm only going to speak from my experience and take from it what you want. But I would say for me, death scenes were probably the easiest as far as methodically processing and doing, because they were the same way every single time. Not that we don't process scenes the same way all the time, because we do have policies and procedures in place. But for me, death scenes were like boom, 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 boom. I knew exactly what I was doing, what was expected of me, who was going to be on scene, or who I may expect to see on scene. And it just was, like I said, pretty systematic. Sometimes where I'm from, we handled a lot of death scenes. So it could be a homicide case, so somebody who was murdered, right? Could have been a suicide, so somebody who took their own life. Could be even an accidental overdose, possibly. Obviously, we're not going to know that necessarily at scene, but we're going to see signs that it's probably an overdose situation, meaning drug overdose or even alcohol. We're going to see or respond to sometimes medical deaths. So people who have, undiagnosed medical conditions that pass away. And then scenes that we don't typically respond to, which would be people who have a history of medical conditions like cancer or something like that, where death is expected, where they have a doctor who is willing to sign off on the death certificate. Typically doesn't require a crime scene response. We are there because something suspicious has occurred, or they don't have a medical doctor who is willing to sign off on the medical death certificate. That's when we're typically going to be responding to crime scenes. And as a crime scene investigator, you are going to get sent that call, whether it be through your dispatch communication center or your supervisor. Somebody's going to alert you to respond to that call. Where I'm from, we get dispatch from police communications. Typically, an officer has already responded to the scene and is waiting for our arrival. They've done preliminary work. We're not going to get into that aspect of it today. So when I get dispatched or I got dispatched a call, I would look at the case comments from our DXT, which is our computer station in our vehicle, and it would say, something common. You have, a 90, not, I want to say that, but a 21-year-old female who was found unresponsive in her bedroom. And then you might have some miscellaneous information on there. Like no signs of forced entry, no signs of apparent trauma, officers waiting by, medical investigator has been notified. So that tells me that the medical investigator from the medical examiner's office has been notified that we have a death, and that they are going to determine, based off the information they've received, will they send a medical investigator, death investigator out to that residence or that location to investigate as well. And so they'll make that determination as well on their own based on the preliminary information that they receive from officers. Sometimes you will have something that is a suspicious death, and that warrants homicide detectives to go out there and look for themselves. And then they can determine when they're out there, is this going to require a homicide response? Is this suspicious in nature? So you may arrive on scene as a crime scene investigator, and you'll have your patrol officers on scene. You'll have a detective from homicide typically on scene if it is ruled to be suspicious or homicide in nature. They don't typically, at least the agency I work for, homicide detectives don't typically respond to suicides or overdoses. So they mostly respond to suspicious deaths that look like it's homicidal in nature. So I'm going to be looking at those case comments to kind of try to determine what it is I'm responding to, because I want to be able to evaluate, do I have all the equipment I'm going to need? Do I have all the packaging material I'm going to need? How long is this typically going to take? So am I prepared to be there for a while? Have I gone to the bathroom? Have I grabbed a bite to eat? Do I have water? Do I have snacks? Do I have things that if I needed to be out there for several hours, I could be out there, take a short break, do what I need to do, and then go back into my scene. A lot of times for me, when it was a homicide or officer involved shooting, I guess we can even say that, there's going to be conversations going on between the homicide sergeant and one of our supervisors on staff. If there's not a supervisor on staff, usually it would be with one of us. And so they are going to work out the logistics as far as who's going, what they're going to be doing, what the expectation is. So you're also having that conversation when it's a homicide or officer involved shooting. The other type of death scenes that I mentioned, we take care of those ourselves. We don't typically need any type of intervention or direction from supervision. Excuse me. Another thing that homicides would respond to, homicide detectives, would be death investigations involving children or babies. They would typically respond to those as well. So you might see a little bit of conversation going on again with supervision to ensure that they have staffing to meet that need, especially if there starts to be secondary scenes where search warrants need to be served. They want to work out those logistics so that we get the staffing in and staffing responded, and also make sure we have all the instrumentation or chemicals, advanced chemicals that we might need to actually work that scene. I guess you could say it's an advantage to not being a supervisor because you don't really have to deal with all of that. But then there are times when there's not a supervisor on duty and you are required to step up and make some of those decisions and, make sure that you're handling the situation appropriately. As far as going to the scene, it's going to be similar to what I would have done any other time, right? Going to a scene, finding out where it's located, meeting with who's ever in charge at the scene, whether it be the primary police officer or if there's a detective on scene, I'm going to be making contact with them. Hopefully I'll have some type of debriefing. Okay, what happened? Who's involved? What's the time frame? Is there forced entry? Is there any video or any type of cell phone data that I need to know about? Any hazards in the home, like animals? It could be even people who do not like PD, especially if you're going to a scene. So for instance, for me, I went to a death scene where the person who was deceased is a gang member. So obviously we had to take precautions because they do not like police and made it very clear that they didn't necessarily want us in their home. And also you had to think about rival gangs, which we did in this instance, responding to the home or showing up at the home because there were issues going on between the different gangs. So we actually had extra police personnel there to, ensure safety and also try to mitigate any issues had there been some with the other gang. So, I go to that scene. speak with the officers. He kind of gives me the heads up of what's going on, who the decedent is, the circumstances around the incident, and kind of the basic overall environment and the feel of, the scene in general with the people who are there. And you have to know that anytime you go into a death scene and there's family members or close friends, it's going to be highly charged and it's going to be emotional. So this is where that mental aptitude comes into play. You need to keep it in check. You need to be professional and show a little bit of compassion and sympathy, as hard as that can be sometimes. So, go into the scene, talk to the officer. He gives me the information. I go into the decedent's bedroom, take a look around. Obviously, I'm looking for things in plain view. I'm not necessarily digging through closets and drawers and things like that because, that goes beyond my scope. But part of my debriefing from the officer is asking him, did you see anything suspicious? Did you notice anything unusual about him or his condition? What is his history? And I found out, he was gang affiliated, had just gotten out of prison, had went to prison on drug charges, had an extensive drug history use, but the family had told the officer that he was no longer using drugs and that he was clean. So they weren't sure what happened. I think their perspective is that it was a undiagnosed medical condition or just natural causes. So I go in there with all that information. I'm looking in the bedroom. It's a standard bedroom, bed, dresser, that type of thing. I don't see anything unusual near or by him. I don't notice anything unusual about his body, his appearance, right? He doesn't show the signs of like fixed rigor or anything like that. So that means I can move his limbs freely. He is starting to have some lividity set in, and that happens when blood pools to the lowest point. So you'd expect to see that dark purple discoloration to his backside because he was on his back. One of the things I'm always checking and asking is, has the body been moved since it was discovered? A lot of people will move the body off the bed or wherever it was at and put it on the floor to try CPR. Or if fire comes in and they may try CPR because you had to have somebody come in and pronounce them deceased. So did fire move them? Were they moved from the original location? Because I want to be able to make note of that. And when I'm making observations about the condition of the body, I want to be able to determine to the best of my ability, is that in alignment with what we've been told? And so, looking at the body, I don't notice anything, suspicious about it. He's just laying in the supine position, meaning face up on his bed. I don't notice anything suspicious around him on the bed or on the dressers, no known medications, no cell phone, nothing like that. Looking at his arms to see if maybe he's injected anything, or around his nose and mouth to see if he's, snorted or maybe smoked anything. I'm looking at the condition of his fingertips to see if he's, if there's evidence of maybe, smoking or lighting anything up, you start to look for things like that. And then I kind of do a little cursory search of the bedroom just for anything in plain view. And one thing I notice is that behind the door is a bag, like a grocery bag. And I'm like, okay, that must be his trash can. So I just take it and dump it out. And what do I see? I see signs of drug paraphernalia, foil, burnt debris, things that would be consistent with somebody who has done drugs. So that tells me right then he's back on whatever heroin, cocaine, meth, whatever he's taking, he's back on that. This is his bedroom. He doesn't share it with anybody. Hasn't had any visitors, supposedly. So I finished doing what I'm doing, right? So I'm going to photograph my scene with my camera, take field notes. I'm going to document handwritten notes, everything that I see, everything that stands out, anything that could contribute to, the reason why he, is deceased. And I'm going to take really good photographs of the entire bedroom, walking through every side of the bedroom, photographing it in its condition. I'm going to photograph the body as it is, from the face, the sides of the face. I'm going to photograph from the top looking down. So that means I'm probably going to climb up on top of the bed and photograph the full length of the body and the stomach and the arms. I'm going to photograph front and backs of the hands. I'm not going to photograph anything on the backside until the death investigator gets there, because the scene belongs to the police, but the body belongs to the medical examiner. So we don't move the body. meaning us police, me, crime scene, we don't move the body or anything else until medical investigator gets there so they can take their own photographs. So they take their own photographs at scene. They're a little bit different than what we would take, but they're similar in nature for the same reasons. And then at that point, I wait until the medical investigator waits or comes, and that could be anywhere from 15 minutes to 3 hours. It really just depends on their staffing and what kind of calls for service they have. So we're kind of at their beck and call, at their mercy, I guess you could say. And sometimes I'll go back to my vehicle and I'll start writing my report and wait until the medical investigator gets there. And then when they get there, they meet with the officer, get a basic rundown of what happened, similar to what I do. Him and I, or if it's a she, will talk about what I found at the scene. They'll make contact with the family and explain the whole, autopsy process and who the doctor will be performing the autopsy. We'll give the family members contact information with the report number and contact information if they need to ask questions, and then kind of give them information as far as what they're going to do when they're there. And then the body will be transported, and they'll typically ask the family members, do you want to see the body before the decedent before we leave or not? And then do you want it to be open bag where you can actually see the face or not? So they have that conversation with the family members if there's family members there. And then they'll go into the room or wherever the decedent is, and they'll make their own observations because they have their own policies and procedures that they need to follow. Sometimes they'll collect bodily fluids at the scene as well through the eyes or the groin. Excuse me. So, like I said, they'll look at the body, they'll look for signs that would be indicative with trauma or drug use or anything like that. And then I will take additional photographs as they discover things, and we'll have that conversation as well. And then once we're done with that part, we'll place the decedent either on its side or stomach, and we'll photograph the backside, meaning the back of the head, the back, the legs, all of that. And then the decedent is placed into a transport bag, which is usually a plastic bag. It's labeled with their identifying information. It's zipped up and it's sealed with a number that coincides with the report number, and that's photographed as well. And then I will photograph the area where the decedent was at to show what it looked like after he or she has been removed. And then that's pretty much the extent of my part. If there's medication or drugs or anything on the cell phone that I need to photograph, I will do that, making sure that I photograph multiple photos, anything that's identifying with serial numbers, damage, anything like that. I will also photograph how many, if they have prescription medication, how many pills are in each bottle, who the prescription was issued to. If there's suspected drugs, I'm going to photograph all of that, any of the paraphernalia, and I'm going to collect that for later analysis if the homicide detective or, needs to have anything analyzed. We can do that as well. And then I pretty much am done with my scene from there for just a standard death investigation. Obviously, if it's a homicide investigation, it's way more extensive. But, like I said, we go out to homicide scenes. We do natural scenes where doctors aren't willing to sign off on the medical death certificate. Overdoses, suicides are the same way. It's handled very similar. Obviously, there is another element to that because now the person has actually intentionally taken their life. And so you're having to deal with that dynamic when you have family who are on scene. That's very traumatic for them. If I have somebody who maybe hung themselves, we are going to do a lot more photographs, right? We're going to photograph, obviously, the positioning of the body. We're going to, let's say they're hanging in the garage from a rafter. We're going to photograph whatever they used to hang themselves. We're going to measure it to show the length of it. We would never remove it from the neck. That would be the medical examiner, the doctor's job to do that. We would cut it or try to untie it from the rafter, depending on what we need to do. But that's a decision that I would make with the medical investigator who arrives on scene. So clearly there's going to be additional photographs for that. Maybe they left a note that would be documented through photographs and that would be collected as evidence. And then sometimes there'll be, if it's an intentional act, they'll leave documentation out for us. Could be life insurance policies, could be cell phone, text messages, could be any of those type of variables also included that I would photograph and document as well. I may or may not take the items as evidence. It really just depends on the circumstances of the case. If anything, I could collect them and then they can be returned to family members at the end of the investigation if need be. Another type of scene that we handle are drownings, because we're out here in Arizona. We get way too many drownings. And it's not just children, it's adults too. Could be people who trip over something out at the pool and hit their head and fall into the pool and drown. Could be somebody in the pool who has a medical condition and drowns. It could be somebody who's highly intoxicated or, taken some prescription medication or recreational drugs and gotten into the pool and drowned. It could be someone who couldn't swim, so who drowned. Could be a child, a baby. All of those things are factors in drownings. So some of the things that I would look for, especially with minors or children, juveniles, babies, toddlers, is what kind of protective measures do they have around the pool? So in Arizona, they require you have extra fencing around your pool based on a certain year. I can't remember the year they implemented that. So we'll look for that. We'll take photographs of the gates and heights of the fence to determine if they're in, compliance. If there was something defaulty in the fencing, in the locking mechanisms. Was the gate locked? Was it not locked? Who had access to it? When was the last time, the gate was open? So those are things that we're going to try to ascertain. Also, if they don't have a actual gate around the pool or some type of security measure over top of the pool, what access is there to the pool from the house? Is it patio doors, French doors, sliding glass doors, windows? And then I want to know what those look like. Are they locked? Are they unlocked? Have they been pried open? Is there an alarm system on those doors or windows? So I'm going to be documenting all of that. And then I'm going to be documenting the condition of the pool, photographing the pool. I'm also going to document the depth of the pool. Were there pool toys in the pool? Because if it's a child, maybe I can't tell you how many times they've been trying to reach for a toy that they've seen at the bottom of the pool or floating on top, and that's how they fall in. So I'm going to be documenting the depth of the pool. And then I'm also going to be trying to ascertain who is home with the child or the person. Were they home by themselves? Was there a party going on? How many adults were there? Were the parents there? Was this a daycare facility? All these things are going to come into play when I take my photographs. And obviously, I'm going to be debriefed by detective who's on scene and the police officer who's on scene. So all these things are going to come into play. Any open alcohol containers, drugs, anything like that could contribute to somebody's death. Negligence, any of that. I'm going to want to document with photographs, making sure that when I'm walking through my scene, I'm taking thorough notes, documenting conditions, sizes, damage, whether something is present or not present at the scene. And then obviously I'm going to use those notes to write my report. And my photographs are going to be very similar as I do for all of my crime scenes, right? I'm going to photograph the address where I'm at. I'm going to photograph the front of the house or the business wherever I'm at to document where I'm located. So everybody who's reviewing my report and my photos know exactly where I'm at. I'm going to go out to the backyard. So let's say I'm going to a pool drowning. I'm going to document the entire backyard. I'm going to 4-point that yard and take as many photos as I need to capture the condition when I arrive on scene. So I'm going to walk around that pool taking all kinds of photos. I'm going to photograph inside the pool. I'm going to use a polarizing filter, probably if it's during the day, which allows that glare or that reflectance that the sun, when it strikes the water, it will give off a, what's the word I want to say? Inaccurate estimation of where something is in the water, right? Because there's a refractive index that's been applied because the sun glows, strikes that watery surface, which is reflective. And when those sun rays hit the water, it bounces off and it actually makes the item that may be down at the bottom of the pool look like it's not actually where it's at, right? It's not an accurate representation of a location of something that's submerged in water. So without getting too scientific, we talk about refractive index and how that plays into how something appears into a reflective surface. So I put a little filter. It's like a little round filter I put on my lens that helps get rid of that refractive index, that reflection. And it actually allows me to document that submerged item accurately in the water. So it gives a better representation of where it actually was compared to maybe where the body was found. But also we need to take into account bodies float and all those things come into play. So I will make sure I'm doing that as well. And then, like I said, if there's anything on scene, like I said, doors, windows, security devices, open alcohol containers, not that it's illegal to drink and swim, but those things may contribute to negligence, right? And then I'll document as much as I can. And then usually when I get there, the body's already been removed and it's been transported to the hospital. So at that point, there's not typically a body in the water. It's, like I said, been removed and transported. But I may have to go to the hospital to where it was the decedent was transported to photograph the body there as well. So my photos are going to be similar to the photos I took at the house, right? Because we want to accurately depict the condition of the body, right? Because that will help us determine, or the medical investigator determine, how long that body was submerged in water or floating in water, that type of thing. So obviously I'm going to photograph the face, the head, the torso, the legs, the feet, the tops and bottoms of hands, the back of the body, as well as any identifying marks like tattoos, scars. Maybe they struck their head or something when they fell into the pool, or if they got involved in some type of altercation that caused them to go into the pool. I would want to document any injuries as well with my camera, also documenting them with field notes, how they observed. So that anybody who needs to look at my notes has a really good idea what I saw when I arrived on scene. Because what if my photos become corrupted at some point, which has happened, and they don't have my photos to look back at? I need to make sure that my field notes are very detailed, copious notes. So that's kind of what we would do, in a situation like that. And plus, there are times also when we respond to the hospital because somebody has passed away. And again, maybe it was from an aggravated assault where somebody was beaten up or assaulted and sustained pretty serious injuries. We may have responded to the hospital at the time to photograph and document their injuries, but maybe now they're deceased. So we had to go back up there and take photos of the body in its current condition as well. But all of these reports, anything I collect from the scene and photos, they're all going to be my forms of evidence. And I will write the report, fill out any appropriate chain of custody forms or evidence logs and photographic logs, evidence processing logs, if it requires fingerprint processing or DNA collection. And that's all going to be released with my report. And one thing to remember is photos are always considered evidence. So can never delete any photos at a scene. It doesn't matter how bad the photo is, you got to keep it in there. So OME, again, the medical investigator's office of the medical examiner's office, they will send somebody out typically for drownings as well. And they will do their investigation typically, and then they will respond to the hospital as well. And then that body gets transported down to the medical examiner's office where an autopsy is scheduled, and then they determine cause and manner of death on that decedent. One of the other things we also do is, when children die, babies die, SIDS death or suspicious deaths, we also go out for those scenes as well. And those are also very traumatic. I mean, I remember I went to a death scene where I had twin babies and one of the twins died. I don't know why the baby died. Obviously, there were no signs of trauma. So could it be, natural causes? Could it be an undiagnosed medical conditions? It could have been SIDS. I don't know the cause of death, but it was very, very sad, especially because the other twin, they clearly know something is wrong when their other twin is gone. So in those instances, it's very traumatic because you have family there and, they may be up at the hospital because obviously the baby may have been transported. There's nothing like seeing a deceased infant, or a toddler. There's just nothing that can prepare you for what you see. It's, even like when I think back with babies who've died, it's almost like they're doll-like it's just, like I said, you can't, that's not normal to see. That's not normal for that family to experience that and live through that. It's just very traumatic all around. So you want to be respectful of their space. You want to be respectful of their time. And so you want to work efficiently and effectively and methodically. And obviously this is when your policies and procedures really help you, because that emotional element comes into play. And unless you have that reined in, it can deter you from doing your job effectively or efficiently. Regardless, if you try, it can cause issues. You're normal, you're human, just like everybody else. So having those policies and procedures in place really will be beneficial because you will fall back on that, take the emotion out of that scene, like block it off, push it away, close that door, and turn around and focus on the tasks at hand. What do I need to do on the scene to do this job effectively and efficiently? So the best benefits this victim, this decedent, this family, these friends, your community. And, so if I have a deceased child, infant, I want to photograph where did they sleep? Their crib, their bassinet, their stroller. It needs to be documented. Was there anything in the crib that could have hindered their breathing? How are they positioned in the crib or the bassinet? So I need to find that out from the officer so I can photograph from that vantage point. I need to collect bedding. I need to collect clothing that may have been on scene. I need to collect diapers that were disposed of or was on the child. I need to photograph any formula or medications that the infant or child was given. I need to collect samples of that medication or formula from that child. I need to collect samples so that can be tested if we need to. I need to do, let's say the child was sleeping with a parent and they rolled over on the child. I need to collect that bedding. I need to photograph that bedding, look for any stains or anything unusual. Maybe the child fell off the bed and sustained a head injury. I need to measure the height of that bed. What did it come in contact with? So I need to look for any kind of damage or stains from that contact. So these are all things that I'm going to be thinking about when I'm going into these death investigations involving children, involving infants, and I'm having these conversations with my detective about things that they've learned during the course of the investigation that might help me be more efficient at my job, crime scene processing. And you will, and it is a fluid situation, so things are going to come up. Was there domestic violence in the home? Was there child abuse in the home? Was child protective services involved in the family? Who did they live with? Who lived at the home? What kind of home life was there? All these things are going to come into play, and I have to document those if they're relevant to the crime scene, right? To the crime. So again, if I'm going into a bedroom where an infant was sleeping, I'm going to photograph that room methodically from all sides, all four walls. Then I'm going to photograph the crib. It's an entirety. I'm going to photograph brands. I'm going to photograph how high the, bed rails were up. Were they down? I'm going to measure those so we know the width and the height of them. Are they defective? Were they working properly? I'm going to, document the condition of the bedding on the crib. Are there any stains? Are there any rips? Are there stuffed animals? Are there comforters? What's inside the crib? I'm going to document those with photographs showing the full picture. And again, any stains, any defects, anything that could help aid with the investigation. And all those things are going to be collected as single pieces of evidence. They're all going to be put in their own proper evidence bag. They're going to be sealed with tape. They're going to be documented with my integrity seal, which means it has my initials, it has the date, it has a case number maybe, it has my employee identification number on there, and it's going to be completely filled out on the front, giving the case number, the date, the number of item it is, so that we can quickly identify it. All those things are going to be filled out completely, and then they're going to be submitted to our evidence section. And typically anything that is like this, that might have biological evidence on it, would be frozen to try to maintain the integrity of any possible biological evidence. And then when I'm done with my scene, I might capture a few additional photographs of, information that has been gathered during the course of the investigation as well. And, medical investigator might come out on that. It just depends on, if the medical investigator deems it necessary to come out to that scene, which they typically should. Yeah, so death investigation scenes can be pretty methodical, ABCD, as far as the processing part. One of the things I learned early on is working with death investigators so I had a scene where I had somebody who, I swear when I walked into the bathroom, I thought it was a homicide scene. There was a lot of bodily fluids projected everywhere around this body, the decedent. And it was like red and dark brown, and it looked like spatter, and he was laying in a weird position in the bathroom, and I was like, wow, this might be a homicide investigation. I'm seeing all this, bodily fluids everywhere. I've never seen anything like this. And then the medical investigator gets out there. He's like, oh no, this isn't a homicide scene. He had a gastrointestinal issue and he basically bled out of his mouth. So it turned into aspirated blood where it sprayed everywhere. And he also aspirated out of his bottom area as well. So you see that a lot with people who have like kidney disease, liver disease, who have, gastrointestinal bleeding, internal bleeding. And at some point, your body can't hold all that blood and it just basically explodes and they'll die. And so I got to learn that from the medical investigator. I thought that was really fascinating because I literally walked in that scene and thought, oh my gosh, this guy's had some major trauma somewhere because of all this, what looked like blood spattered everywhere. And that's where it comes into play, just having experience and having training and having education and working along the experts. In this instance was a death investigator who had a plethora of experience, obviously, in responding to these internal bleeding death investigations. And so I took that with me moving forward. So again, wealth of knowledge. And then some of the other things I learned with working around death investigators is, petechia, how that shows up. And that's you can see it in the eyes, in the whites of the eyes, and it looks like little tiny red dots. And so that can be consistent with somebody who has been strangled. Not always, but if somebody has faced some type of oxygen deprivation. So we can look at that in the eyes and say, oh, I see some petechia. Maybe there was, an altercation. Because when somebody's strangled, you won't always see immediate indications that they were strangled. If you recall, several episodes ago, I talked about the homicide victim who was a victim, the serial killer, and who was left on the side of the street, and it was determined that she was a victim of a serial killer and she had been strangled, but we couldn't tell that at the scene. It was discovered later during the course of the autopsy. So I learned quite a bit from these death investigators. And one of the other things I learned is people who have heart disease, heart attacks, sometimes you'll see the earlobe will be creased, and that can be indicative of heart disease or a heart attack. So I learned that. Also, some of the things I learned with diabetics is the discoloration in the lower portion of the shins and the feet and the condition of the feet. That can be indicative of diabetes and diabetes-related conditions that can contribute to somebody's death. So the death investigators are, again, great knowledge, great skill, great asset to have on your death investigation scenes. Some of the other things, like I said, we worked officer-involved shootings. So typically, the body isn't transported on those scenes. Obviously, they're going to render care and aid, but if they are pronounced dead at the scene, they're going to stay there until the medical death investigator arrives on scene. And those scenes are a little bit more challenging to work, but yet similar in nature because they are a death scene, but you have a new element where it is an officer that's typically caused the death. So we kind of break those scenes up into two, or we did at the time. And I know that the agencies here in the Valley are doing things differently, where they are no longer investigating their own officer involved in shootings. They usually have Arizona Department of Public Safety coming out to handle those investigations, which has their own crime scene unit. But prior to that, we handled our own death scene investigations. And, we kind of handled it in two scopes. We had the actual scene where the shooting occurred. And then we had the second scene, which is the officer and his or her weapons. So we have to do both scenes. If you're lucky, you'll get an extra person out at your scene who can handle one or the other. If not, it'll just be you handling the scene in its entirety. If you're fortunate enough to have a volunteer crime scene unit, you might get a volunteer out that can assist you with packaging and supplies and so forth, which is very helpful at a scene like that. But our crime scenes, when it comes to officer-involved shootings, are going to be handled very similarly than normal death scenes. You're going to go to a debriefing. You're going to hear the incident, what happened. You're going to take copious notes, right, based on the information you've been told. You're going to walk through your crime scene. You're going to make your own observations. Typically, you're going to have a homicide detective with you who's going to walk through the crime scene with you and point detail out. And then you're going to make your own observations. And then you're going to elaborate and talk about the scene itself, what it is you're seeing, and then how you're going to approach and tackle the actual crime scene processing, what they're looking for. And they're really going to rely on you and your expertise forensically for this part. So at that point, I'm going to walk through, take my notes, then I'm going to take my camera, which it always starts with the camera, right? And I'm going to take methodical photographs of the entire scene. So 4-pointing my scene, doesn't matter if I'm outside or inside, I'm going to 4-point that scene, documenting the scene from the top to the bottom and everything in the middle. And then determining, I've determined at this point what is evidence, what's related, what's probative, and I'm going to do the same thing with all those pieces of evidence. I'm going to photograph it in the scene, a really overview, large view of all the evidence in that maybe immediate area. And then I'm going to do what we'd consider a mid-range photograph. And what that does is establish the evidence in the scene with a fixed object to the best of your ability, right? Because if you're outdoor, you have an outdoor scene, that makes it a little bit more difficult. But I'm going to look for something that is close to the piece of evidence that is stationary, and I'm going to photograph from that vantage point. And then I'm going to do what I call an evidence establishing photograph that photographs that specific piece of evidence close up. So it shows serial numbers, damage, anything unique about that specific piece of evidence. And then I'm going to do the same group of photographs with an evidence placard. So you've seen evidence placards in all your TV shows and documentaries, and they're yellow, they're green, they're orange, and they have numbers or letters on them. And so I'm going to take all of my evidence placards and I'm going to place them next to each piece of evidence, singularly. Never going to collect everything at once or together because that would cause cross-contamination. I also want to keep in mind that I'm changing out my gloves, changing out booties, making sure I am keeping control of who's walking in and out of my crime scene, making sure that there's a crime scene log so people who are coming in to the crime scene have logged in and given a purpose as to why they're at that crime scene. And then I'm going to collect all that evidence, obviously packaging them separately, securing them in my work vehicle. And then I might look to see if I need to do any biological collection or fingerprint processing. And then, process for fingerprints, looking for surfaces that are suitable to put black powder on, and looking for instances where there might be biological evidence like blood, sweat, saliva, semen, vaginal fluids, anything like that may be related to the scene or the incident and probative. And, we do those on all of our crime scenes as well. And once I've completed that, if you work for an agency, you will have somebody who's done sketching. In my agency, the detectives did our sketching. So that's something homicide would have done for me. And then we also can now they're using drones to capture the scene image. They're also using the 360 cameras, which we did have for a while until we got into software updating and the expense of updating software. And so when I was still at the agency, we discarded our 360 camera for that purpose. So they may be using something new like a Faro scanner or just relying on drones. That could be highly plausible now. So once I'm done with the major crime scene and, I've taken photos even from the officer's vantage point. So I'll find out where was the officer at when he or she discharged his duty weapon. And then I will find out where was the victim at or decedent at or suspect at when they were shot. And I will photograph from their vantage point. Obviously, I'm going to be photographing the decedent, same way I would do anytime. Overalls of the body, face, torso, legs, rolling them over on their side or back, doing the same thing on the head, the back of the torso, the back of the legs, the hands, tops in the fronts. Any injuries, I would be documenting injuries, any type of trace evidence I might see on the body. I'm going to be documenting that, trying to collect that through collection methods, whether it be through lifting or tweezers or another means. So obviously waiting for the medical investigator to get out there before we do anything with the body. Again, because the body belongs to them, not to us. Once that body has been transported, then I can go to the officer who's typically on scene. I'm going to photograph the officer from the front view, and we always want them in uniform. photographing them from the front view, a mid-range from the waist up, and then a face. And then they're going to do a full 360 rotation. I'm going to photograph from the waist up. I'm going to photograph their hands, depicting any injuries, top and bottom. Then with the firearm range master who is on scene, we're going to photograph the duty weapon that they used and that they had during the officer-involved shooting. We're going to photograph the weapon in its entirety, front, side, back, muzzle, serial numbers, all of the ammunition, head stamps of the ammunition. We're going to photograph all of that in detail, making sure we capture every image, and then the firearm and the ammunition all will go with the firearms master from the range, and any evidence I collected from the scene, I will take that back to the crime lab, make sure it's properly packaged, or if it needs to be dried, let's say if it's bloody or wet, I need to dry it out before I can submit it to our evidence section, because putting something that's wet or damp into a locker will create mold and could really, really damage, ruin, alter any biological evidence. And then once it's dried, I could package it properly and then submit it to our evidence section. So that's kind of what we would do for death scenes as a whole, kind of approach them the same, although they're not all quite the same. It's really important that you're ascertaining the correct information, that they are updating you, because it's a fluid situation, because you don't want to forget something, leave something behind, or not document something or collect something. And then, in these scenes, if you determine you need to use, advanced processing methods like a chemical blood reagent like leucocrystal violet, amino black, or luminol, that you have access to that and you have time to properly use it, and you have it documented. And so that's typically what we would do for death scenes. And, I would say death scenes are the easiest, but they're also challenging because they have different challenges than a normal crime scene would be, than a burglary or a fight or a stolen car or a car accident, right? You have a human element involved. You have high emotion. It's highly charged depending on the circumstances. So that adds a whole new element to your crime scene work. So hopefully, you learned a few things as far as, the processing of death scenes and how those are handled. And like I said, my agency, we handle pretty much all death scenes. We go out there, we take notes, we process with photographs, we sometimes process for fingerprints and DNA. We collect items and we write a report and we issue that report. It's pretty standard, and it's thanks to our pretty strict policies and procedures that are set by our agency and our crime lab and the accreditation standards that we had to adhere to. So I appreciate everybody for, tuning in, and I hope you learned something new about death scenes and how that can be processed. So we typically don't go to autopsies unless we want to, which we don't have time to. So we're not usually part of that process. And every once in a while, when we have a homicide and the homicide detective has gone down and attended the autopsy, they will bring back personal belongings from the decedent, typically the clothing and jewelry. We will take that into possession from the detective, and we will photograph that evidence as well. And it might require us, storing it in a drying room or cabinet until it's completely dry, and then photographing any evidence that's on that clothing. Maybe there's, defects from a stabbing or a gunshot. So we would want to photograph those defects after it's been dried thoroughly, and then we can package it separately and submit it to the evidence section. So those are some of the extra steps we may take when we have a death scene like that, the medical examiner has removed personal effects off of the body and given them to the detective at the time. And then they bring them to us, and then we take possession or custody of those items and then dry them if they need to be dried, and then take additional photographs when they need to be photographed. So, some of those items, I'm photographing sizes, I'm photographing front and back of the shirt or pants or socks or shoes, patterns of the shoes, blood spatter, gunshot residue pattern, all of those things, logos, anything that could be beneficial for the investigation and aid the investigation. I'm going to photograph those as well and document those in scene notes as well and include those in my reports as well. So yeah, lots of detail goes into doing, any type of crime scenes, but specifically death scenes as well. And I remember I don't know what, it was a death scene and there was a stabbing, I think it was. And there was an expert that was called in to examine the clothing or the shirt of the person. I don't remember if it was a suspect or victim, but I just so happened to be at our headquarters building, dropping off evidence. And I see, detectives standing around this shirt and this guy, and he's like looking at the shirt and, really reviewing it. And I was like, oh, what you guys doing in here? And he's like, oh, he's an expert. He's going to be making a testimony, but he wanted to see the garment. And I was like, oh, that's my shirt. I collected it from the scene, blah, blah, blah. And I took photographs. He goes, oh my gosh, the expert said this to me. He goes, you did an amazing job documenting this shirt, the defects on this shirt, the condition of the shirt. He goes, it is so helpful. And I was like, what are the odds that I would actually be at police headquarters dropping off other evidence and see him there and for him to be able to tell me this? And it was so awesome to be able to get that feedback from him, because sometimes the only feedback you hear is the negative, what you didn't do right or what you could have done better. So I really appreciated that he took the time to tell me that. So if you enjoyed this episode of Through the CSI Lens Behind the Yellow Tape, the best way to support the show is by, again, leaving a quick rating or review. And it helps me and helps more people find the show and find us and keeps us bringing more straight from the scene, crime scene, scenarios. And so just make sure to hit follow so you don't miss an episode. Reach out to us anytime. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, send us an email. Until then, stay curious. Make sure to share the podcast with your friends and family. I appreciate it. And I'll see you guys behind the tape. Thanks so much for being here.